I'm Celine Williams, and welcome to the Leading Through Crisis podcast, a conversation series exploring resiliency and leadership in challenging times. My guest today is Dr. Roz Cohen, Chief People Officer at LNW Advisors, and a leader who brings together the theoretical and practical in order to create cultures where everyone truly belongs. Welcome, Roz.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be here.
I'm really lucky that I get to talk to some pretty cool people on this podcast. I'm very excited to get to talk to you and to connect with you today. But before we get into all of the details of your story and my barrage of questions that will inevitably happen, I'm going to ask the question I always start with, which is, the name of the show is Leading Through Crisis. When you hear that phrase, what comes up for you?
It's a good question. Immediately, I wonder, what do we mean by crisis? Because I think how people look at crisis can be indicative of how they lead through it, right?
Yeah.
And this is not some HR jargony type of thing, but really, if you think of things that happen as opportunities, both to communicate messaging, to reconnect people to a message, to share and really be transparent, that's a very different mindset than coming from like, oh my God, what are we going to do about this? The sky is falling, whatever. Also, not to be said that there are not some real things that are real crises, but it really is about perspective and how are we going to think about this and what are we going to do moving forward? So that's what comes up for me.
So I'm going to ask a question about that, because I think that's a very important thing to consider. And my bias, just so you know, is I agree. I think individually we define crisis differently, and then organizations define, and teams, and like you can, micro, macro.
Right.
And so that's part of where this show comes from, is my curiosity around that and what that looks like. And from your perspective, whether or not teams, organizations, groups are formally defining crisis, do you see some version of that, whether you're like, here's what we consider a crisis that we can think about, or, but to avoid some of the reactivity that can happen otherwise, is there something that you recommend when it comes to that, or you've seen work when it comes to thinking about these kind of challenges? Let's call them challenges currently.
Fabulous. Love it. Love it. Love the vernacular. I have this sort of way in which I think about things, for good or for bad, but it's this, what's the foundation that we want to always make sure we're operating from? And whether that's an overarching mission or a values or whatever the case may be. Because if we say that in general, we believe that anytime we have a chance to talk with our employees, to share with them the why things are happening, to be transparent as much as possible. I'm not a big fan of this radical transparency thing. I don't think it works. But if we think of all of these as opportunities to do that, then it's just about how do we do it? It's about what's the messaging that makes the most sense for this. So the first thing to do is define on what are our values? What are the things that we are going to lead with and we are going to look for in all opportunities that we have? And then figuring out the behaviors that will support that. So if your vision, or if the goal is to always be able to share information clearly and transparently, well, then what are the behaviors that would help hold that up? Then you can always go back to those behaviors when you're in the middle of a crisis. So when we said we're going to do this, we say that this is what it looks like. So what do we need to do in this particular circumstance? So there is a really strong need to be proactive as opposed to reactive. We've had plenty of experiences over the course of the past 5 years, whether it's COVID or change of the administration, the White House, or whatever it is, where we've had to communicate as companies or individuals. So we have plenty of opportunities to think about it from that perspective and plan versus being reactive.
Yeah. And I love what you said, again, fully biased in this, but I love what you said around defining the behaviors associated with those values, whatever that category is. I think that is so often the piece that isn't done. It's the words, I always say, we get a lot of words on walls, like
Yes. Yes.
integrity. And this is my
Right.
definition of
Right.
integrity. And
That's right.
people go, perfect, but there's no behavior associated with
Right.
it. So
Right.
it really doesn't, in that challenging moment, in that crisis, that what do we do with it? It's a word on a
Right.
wall.
That's right. The behaviors are so critical because people will emulate what you want them to emulate if you give them an opportunity to see it. And we struggle a little bit with how people gain the behavior versus the demonstration of the behavior. And what I mean by that goes back to some DEI stuff. Regardless of your political stance, because we're not here to discuss that, it's what are, it doesn't matter how someone achieved the ability to have integrity. But what matters is, what are the behaviors? Do those align with the organization? So when you're looking at things like recruiting and hiring, I don't care whether you've been got the scholarship to Yale and are doing A, B, and C, or you're a kid that's come from someplace else that went to a state school. It doesn't matter. If you're able to demonstrate the ability and the behaviors that make us successful as an organization, that's what's important. Doesn't matter the where.
So this is not where I was going to go with this, but I'm going to ask about that because in the past week, I have had multiple conversations with people around how terrible the hiring process is specifically, and talking about what you're talking about, which is like, we focus on the someone's education or their past experience that's on a resume in such a way, and then ask questions that are either so generic that everyone can plan for them, or don't really get into real behaviors, right? Like it's just, it hasn't been set up that way. And with the advent, or with the, not advent, maybe I'll say advent, with the advent of AI, people are really designing resumes that are going to hit every high note. So absolutely, context of why I'm kind of, going off the rails slightly for a second. Because I think what you said is really interesting when you're talking about the behaviors and demonstrating those behaviors. I 100% agree with you. And how do you have any suggestions for leaders who are having this? I'm not kidding you. I've had this come up in the past week, probably 6 or 7 times in conversation, where it's like, what do we do? What do we do about this?
So it's very funny. My doctoral dissertation was around inclusive leadership, employee engagement, and identity. And I'm subsequently writing a book, funny enough, called Hiring for Engagement.
Oh my gosh.
It's really funny how all this comes to play.
I love that the sidebar is actually like, well, here we go. Perfect.
So here's because I come at this from a pragmatic stance, give you a little context. Theoretically, we talk about engagement being a bunch of different things. Practically, what I found in my research, and this is building off of others, obviously, was that there are 3 kinds of engagement. There's an I think, there's an I belong, and there's an I feel. I'm boiling down the book. That's why book details, but the I think behavior is sort of how you perceive the work that you do, what gives you that sort of intellectual charge. The other 2 are more involved in the culture of an organization. So what I found was, you can hire for, let me say this differently, you may have to edit this little piece. I belong and I feel really has is impacted by how a manager acts. If you act in certain ways that are more inclusive, if you act in ways that bring people together to create this space of belonging, you can do that. I think engagement, you can't. And what's happened is, we've been so focused on the degree, the school, the key, what we believe to be key thoughts about the job, that we forget about this I think. So we don't structure processes that try and hit on those marks. We don't structure ways in which people are recruited and way we onboard folks that that connect with that I think mentality. So what I have found is that when we look at what the behaviors of success are within an organization, when we look at people who are successful and how they act, and use that as a way of determining how to hire the right people, we remove some of these biases. It's not an easy process. It takes a while, and there are steps that you should do in order to do that. But you decrease the bias, you decrease the ability for, you end up having the folks who are more likely to be successful in the role end up going through the process. So it's something that is near and dear to my heart, ironically enough, and being able to then talk about what are the behaviors that make us successful as an organization, and how do we make sure that we're hiring people with those characteristics. It doesn't matter how they got them. It doesn't matter that they were at Yale or versus a state school. And the best example I have of this is when I worked at a company previously, and we were looking to hire entry-level folks. And, we had based in California, had all the Stanford grads and everybody who had been doing X, Y, and Z. We had this one resume of a gentleman who was pivoting in his career, a little older than the traditional, was a doorman at a building in New York City, had gone to City College, in one of the city colleges in New York to get his degree. And so when one of the comments that someone said was, well, he went to state school, or he's a doorman. But when we looked at behaviors, we want someone who's going to be able to be customer service oriented. They have to connect with our clients. Well, if you've seen a New York City doorman, they are fantastic at that. We want someone who's going to be able to think through problems, right? So when you understand what makes your people successful and you hire for that, you remove some of the other stuff. So it's interesting. That's literally what the book and my dissertation was about.
So first and foremost, please come back when your book is published, because I would love to talk about this more. And I'm going to put that out there right now. And I love that example of the gentleman who pivoted in that way.
Yeah.
Because I think the reality is that now there are so many people who are pivoting. I think there are so many people, whether it's whatever his reason was, there are so many people in a position where they are either having to or choosing to pivot their career in some way. And they often are overlooked because people are looking at I'm trying to think of a good word for it. Maybe not the things that are going to help them be successful in the role. They're looking at the stuff that we've been told matters most for years.
That's right. And to be fair, what that archetype is very specific, right? And particularly in finance and some other industries, there is a specific archetype that we believe makes people successful.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, because that's how it always has been, not because that's the right answer.
Yeah.
So we have to be thinking about that when we go through this whole process. And it also means being more proactive than reactive, right? Initially, someone leaves the organization, someone picks up the job description, they're like, yeah, looks right. They post it, we go through the process. Well, what if we were doing something a little more proactive? What if every couple of years we're looking at job descriptions and we're asking the people who work with the person, is this really what they do with you? Like, is this still accurate? Does this still make sense? So there's so much that can be done if you're able to look forward versus being reactive in this process.
Yes, I love that. And it's very clear that, the thing that stands out to me, I'm saying very clear, it's what stands out to me is that is the element of critical thinking, which requires us to be proactive, but that element of critical thinking that you're talking about, bringing into the process, that I think is unfortunately often missing, because we do rely on biases, and organizations rely on that. And it's, we think we're thinking critically and we talk about strategic thinking, but we're really that's not what's really happening. And what you're talking about is
Yep.
actually critical thinking and strategic thinking in an intentional way, which is what it's supposed to be.
Yes. We assume, right, that because we've always done it this way, we should always do it this way. And that's not always the case. And it's hard to be the person that does what Simon Sinek talks about all the time, asks the why. Well, this is the kind of person. Well, why? Why is this the person? And when you keep asking that question, you get down to the kernel as to the real reason, and you determine from that whether or not it's the right direction or not the right direction, right? Yeah. Will we hire folks out of these schools? Well, why did we do that? Well, because we found that most people from those schools apply. Well, what? Right. And so if we keep asking the question, not because we're trying to be difficult, but because we're really trying to get to the kernel of what is it we're trying to answer.
Yes.
But you have to have an organization that's open to that. Right. Sometimes when you ask the why, you're seen as, well, you're not on board. You're not. So you have to be careful, right? You have to have, are we comfortable, and is there the psychological safety to ask the hard questions and really go through that exercise? So there's a piece to that that's also got to be built into this discovery process.
Yep. It's interesting you say that. When I went through coach training many moons ago, one of the things that they taught us, I assume they still teach us, going through a formal process of it, was to not ask why questions and to reframe them as what or how questions, because why can't, and I'm not saying I agree with this, that I'm going
no, go ahead. Yeah.
But because a why question can feel like you're questioning someone, motive, intention, whatever, and it can turn into a defensive conversation. And I'm going to say, I acknowledge and I understand that. And that's part of, I think, what you're talking about is, like, you can be seen as not being on board when you ask a why question, when actually sometimes you have to ask a why question to get into the real meat of things.
Yeah. And that's where the psychological safety comes in, right? If I'm with a group of people that I work with that I trust and they know me and I know them, and I ask the why question, it's not about being defensive. It's not about the challenge from a negative perspective, but it's really an opportunity for us to think differently. To examine this concept of cognitive dissonance, right? Where you know information and you get new information that is different than that, and what do you do with it? So if we have the opportunity to be in a safe place where the cognitive dissonance is actually helpful, it doesn't matter whether you say why, how, or what. You're coming from a place to try to get to the best answer, not trying to appease any kind of particular thing.
Yes. I love the way you phrase that. And I don't think we can emphasize enough the importance of getting to the right answer and not trying to just appease someone. And I just want to reiterate that, because the way you phrase that, I think was beautiful and superbly important these days.
Thank you. And I agree. The concept of it is critical.
Yep. So where I was going to go initially, before I sidebarred us into something that was very relevant, was you had actually mentioned this idea of DEI advocacy in your answer, where I then was like, well, let me take you on this route. And I know that has been part and parcel of your career in a very meaningful way, for many reasons, I have no doubt. Clearly from your PhD thesis, it's, it is, I would say it's some element of that is going to be part of your value system, right? It drives you. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your experience in that realm. I know you have a lot of real world experience, and we hear a lot about DEI that's theoretical and not practical. So I would love for you to share some of your stories or some of your insights, because you do have that marriage of the theoretical and the pragmatic in a way that is really beneficial. Because, as I'm sure many people living in 2025 are aware, things are a little odd this year, more so than even usual.
Yes. Yeah. In terms of values, just to give context, I am Jewish. I say that because there are some values as part of Judaism. I'm not practicing. I don't go to temple, none of that. But there are two values that are really critical to who I am and what I do. One is this concept of tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. The other is tzedakah, this idea of giving back. And I'm sure there are people who are going to be like, that's not exactly what it means, Roz. And I acknowledge that, but this is how I see it in my life and how I practice. So the work that I do, particularly around HR, is about those two things. And it's how do we create space to have people show up to be able to do those things. Yeah. So there's a couple of ways that I like to employ it. One is around access. So particularly in the area of financial services, again, if we go with the archetypes, there's a traditional archetype of what people look like. Mostly it's because they've had experience or they've had the opportunity, because families have had the opportunity, because they were born into the right, pick the identity category you want to choose. What happens is we actually don't, folks who look different don't have the same access that other folks do.
Yeah.
And I'm not particularly trying to be vague about identity, but it's less about the particular identity and more about the concept of it. So that's why I'm saying it that way. So what I have strived to do throughout my career is provide access to folks to financial services, to opportunities that may not have had those to begin with. One of the things that I'm most proud of in my career is when I was at a previous organization, we partnered with about 7 organizations that really focused on underrepresented groups and giving them tools to be successful in ways that and in areas that they may not have been. So after a lot of vetting of these organizations, a lot of conversations, both with our internal management and the management of those other organizations, we decided that there was such an alignment between that if you came from one of those organizations, you automatically got a first round. You had the opportunity to interview for positions that maybe you wouldn't have had that access to. It did 2 things. One, it helped us think about what is it we're looking for by way of behaviors that maybe show up differently than we anticipated. But it also allowed these students and undergraduate and graduate students to be able to apply for positions, and then it was theirs to win or lose, right? The organization that they came from would do some training with them and give them some sort of, here's how to think about this, here's how to frame your questions. And then we had a group of people who would interview them. We had a good number, I want to say, remembering, about 40 to 50% of folks who interviewed with us ended up moving through the process. So they went on to second and third interviews. I don't remember, unfortunately, the number that ended up getting hired. But how do you repair the world? Well, you do it one person at a time. So you challenge the systems, you ask why of the systems and why do we continue to do it this way? And you challenge that in the service of how do we provide opportunities for people that may not automatically have those opportunities. So that's sort of how I see my values being reflected. And in every interaction, in every policy that I write or process we put together, these are the questions that I ask. Why do we do it this way? What can we do differently? Are we providing enough access to people who may be qualified, but just don't have the opportunity? So that's sort of how I think about this.
Yeah. And I think that I wish more leaders were intentional when they approached concepts like that in that way. Because it's very clear, Roz, even though you and I have just met, it's very clear to me that you are intentional in your approach to things. And I think there has been this, I'm not even sure if it's deep-seated, but this resistance, there's been kind of 2 things happening from my if I step back and look, and that is that there has historically been this embracing and talk around DEI that may not have been very like the talk about it was intentional, but the actions or how it was implemented seemed to be less intentional, or there was a lot, and these are broad groups. I'm not saying that this is many shades of gray in between, or there were these groups that were just anti-DEI for all of the reasons that still make no sense to me. like
Same.
Full disclosure, doesn't make any sense to me
No.
to just be, to pretend like privilege and where people come from and their access to things doesn't affect their ability to
it's crazy making when you think about it, right?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so I appreciate that you're very intentional in how to actually do something with this concept that we talk about around DEI and put it into action. And what does this look like? And how do we make it real? How do we make it real and not just a talk track?
Well, I would agree. And I would even take it a step further. When we talk about DEI, we talk about, in my world, in my head, when we talk about DEI, we talk about a place that people can connect and belong based upon their identity. Great. Well, how do we do that? Because everyone wants to feel connected and as though they belong to something. So I think a lot of I don't want to say problem, but a lot of the consternation around this topic has been because I want you to recognize who I am as an individual and what I bring. But I also want you to recognize that I have this identity that connects me to other people. And so how do you hold those two things in the same place? There's no great answer. No one's come up with that shining star, so to speak. But that's really what it ends up being. I am a unique person and I have certain characteristics that I want to be valued. And I also am part of this identity group that I also want to be valued. And so you're forcing people into a choice. I've got to pick one or the other. And that's not life. That's not what it is. And so the more we can think about how we create space for those two things to live together, the better off we are. And the happier people will be in an organization.
And it doesn't, to what I hear inside of that is that it shouldn't be a choice. It doesn't have to be a choice, right? It's the whole dialectic thing, right? You're going to hold these multiple thoughts together at the same time, and it's okay that they're different. It's okay that they might seem to be in opposition.
Right.
We live in a world that is many more shades of gray than it is black and white.
Absolutely. And when we can acknowledge that, I mean, it's just people want to be able to say, okay, this is the thing, and I'm now going to act because this is the thing, but it's never really the thing. There's a lot of things.
We really, as humans, want that certainty more than makes sense, in my opinion, with the experience that we have of each and every day. Kind of shows us that certainty is illusory. It's not, and yet we're like, oh, we can create arbitrary categories of certainty, so we're gonna hang on to that because
that's exactly right. Because then I know how to act. Right? If I know that we're gonna say that you are X, Y, and Z identity, and I'm gonna then that is who you are, then I know how to act around you. Because there's a fear factor. Right? There's a fear piece. And if I don't know how to act on you and I say something, then what does that mean? So there's all of that around it. And if we think about it from this concept of how do we create space for people to have both their individual and collective identity and allow them to be that person in the space? If we think about it from that perspective, I bet we come at different answers, and there's less, maybe, there's less sort of fighting or politicizing, let's say.
Well, and wouldn't it be nice if that was the way that we thought about creating psychological safety from the beginning?
100%. right? How great would that be?
Well, and you say that, and I think, oh, that sounds like a very practical approach to what psychological safety could be, as opposed to, again, there's a lot of theory, and I'm not disparaging theory. The
No,
theory matters
absolutely.
and it's important. And
Yeah,
when it's all theory and not a whole lot of practical application or figuring out what
yeah,
works or doesn't
exactly
work,
right.
to me, that is, I think, also part of the problem. And I hate to say this, with a lot of how people see DEI, especially if they're
Yes,
prone to being like, ooh, no DEI for me, is that it's like,
right.
psychological safety, like we're talking about it, but like that's not how the real world works, so that's not how we put it into place. And what you just said is, actually, if we think about this in this way, what can we do?
Right. There's an actionable piece to it, which again, pragmatism, being able to take the theory and when I ask questions in my day job, the questions are, okay, so this is what we need. What does the organization need? How are we going to get there? And what's the risk? And if we look at those things, we can come to an answer that we can live with, and in the best case scenario, help people thrive in. That's where we have to get to, and less about the other stuff. You call it psychological safety. You don't like that term, fine. How do you have people come to work in a place that they feel that they can ask questions, bring their experiences and behaviors in such a way that it is collectively helpful for the organization and the individuals? Whatever you want to call it, I don't care. Fine. We get caught up in language too much sometimes.
Yes. Yep. I concur. And I think that is, I think that's a, I would really love that anyone who is listening or watching actually thinks about whatever we want to call psychological safety in that way as a starting point. Like, just start to think about it a bit differently. Because
Yep.
imagine what you can do with any team that you're working on, that you're part of, that you're leading. Like, you can have a real impact on
Yes.
people.
100%.
I feel like I could ask you 100 more questions, and that we could go into 12 different topics, right? Literally just from what you were just talking about.
Well, I'm happy to come back if you want me back. I'm happy to talk about other things at some point.
Oh, I was so fully, please come back when your book comes out. And I truly, there's so many important practical, can I say practical one more time? But truly, there's so many important practical elements that you spoke about today that I don't think we get into the practical applicability enough. And so,
Yeah.
first and foremost, I want to thank you for that, because that's incredibly important to the world, but also to me. I really appreciate hearing that and having that conversation. Before we wrap up, I just want to ask, is there anything that we didn't get to that you're like, I absolutely want to talk about that today, or that you want to emphasize inside of this? The answer can be no. There's zero pressure either way. I just always want to give the guest the opportunity to bring up or emphasize something if they so desire.
I will say one thing, and that we didn't
Please.
get to today, which is totally, totally fine. When we talk about crisis leadership and we talk about sort of what that looks like, I think leaders have a tendency to become isolating and to sort of turn in. And really, it is the perfect opportunity to bring others into the solution and trying to solution and figure out what the right answer is and how you lead through a crisis. And if we can switch from this, I have to be protective, I've got to sort of turn internally because I'm supposed to know everything, to a, how do we turn around and tell folks, what should we do here? Here's what we're struggling with. How does everybody's different experience and different behavior and sort of what they've gone through help us in leading through that crisis? That would be the only thing I would add.
Yep. I could not agree more. I have probably said 500 times in the last 5 years that it is not one person's responsibility to come up with every answer or to know everything anywhere ever. That's
Absolutely.
not so why I really have a lot of empathy and compassion for leaders who are put in positions or whether, by people around them where it's like, oh, well, you have to find, or they feel like they have to find the answer,
That's
or
right.
whatever the environment is that creates that. Let's stop that. Let's stop that.
Yeah.
Can we stop
Yes.
that? Because
Can we just, if we do that, that would be amazing, right? You don't have to solve every problem. You're not expected to know every answer.
oh, wait, Roz, can we make mistakes too?
You know what? You can't, as long as you own up to the mistakes and say, here's what I'm going to do differently in the future. You can absolutely make whatever mistakes you need to.
This sounds like I would like to work in this environment. This sounds
Yes.
fantastic.
That's right. Exactly.
Let's
Well, that's
let's
what
make
we
that
hope to
happen.
create. That's
Right.
what we hope to create.
I definitely want to have you back. This was a fantastic conversation. I thank you
Agreed.
for your time.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure. It's been a really good conversation. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you.
Oh my gosh, absolutely my pleasure. You can find out more about Roz in the show notes per usual. There'll be links to everything, but I'm going to ask a question. Is LinkedIn the best way to get to connect with you if people want to?
100%.
Okay, so the Roz's LinkedIn will be in the show notes as well. And for those who are listening and just want to note it down, it's Rosalind F. Cohen on LinkedIn. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it as well.
Thanks for joining me today on the Leading Through Crisis podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please take a minute to rate and review us on your podcast app. If you're interested in learning more about any of our guests, you can find us online at www.leadingthroughcrisis.ca.